Welcome to Let's Race, a journey to educate and eradicate, a teen-produced podcast aiming to educate about the role and impact of race in the United States, with the goal of eradicating systemic racism one step at a time. Each week, I'll be joined by experts specializing in topics concerning race, and they'll share their wisdom on how we can make a change in our community. My name is Elizabeth Choi, and I will be your host for this podcast. Today, I'll be joined by Norma Vidal, who will be sharing on her experiences as a graduated student heavily involved with race advocacy at UCI. During her time at UCI, she was involved with the Cross Cultural Center, MEChA, and the Latinx Resource Center. Through these organizations, her activism has focused on educating others on social issues impacting the Latinx community, including colorism, racism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigenous rhetoric, Machismo, Marianismo, and more. She's pursuing a career in education and has worked closely with many nonprofit college preparatory programs that support students from under-resourced communities in getting into college. A fun fact about Norma is that she is from East LA, a historically Mexican-American subcity that is known for its activism in the Chicano Movement, specifically the East LA walkouts. So I'm really excited to talk to you today, Norma, and I look forward to hearing all you have to say.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start out by asking, as someone who's worked with various organizations like the Cross Cultural Center at UCI, what inspired your commitment to racial equity?
Honestly, a lot of the commitment to racial equity just comes from experiencing discrimination. I am Mexican American, and although I haven't experienced as much discrimination as other people in the Latinx community, whether that be because they have a darker skin color or, they only speak Spanish or etc. There's multiple reasons why other people from my community can be discriminated against more. I definitely have experienced some. Most of it is like microaggression. So I have had the opportunity to do a lot of internships. And during that internship, like sometimes people just come up to me and they're just like, oh, like, where are you from? Like, they're just very confused as to how I have an internship there. They think I'm like an international student, so on. Like, they're just like, oh, like, where are you from? Like, are you from Mexico? And I'm like, I don't take offense because obviously I'm Mexican, but I'm like, why is it such like a surprise to you that I could get this internship? Because mainly my internships are in like predominantly white spaces. I had a few internships in museums and stuff. So yeah, it's okay. It's definitely like a experience that you learn how to navigate. You're just kind of like, oh, like, just leave me alone. But yeah, honestly, a lot of it comes from just like experiencing it in your everyday life. But also like a lot of people of color experience discrimination on their everyday life. It's just sometimes they don't know the right terminology to it, but it's not that they don't know about it or they don't experience it. Obviously, no one wants to be discriminated against, so it comes with standing up for yourself and really learning how to navigate those situations. But yeah, and also my high school teachers were really great. They taught a lot about like social issues and highlighted like social issues in their lessons. They taught through like a critical lens, which basically just means like they didn't tell me information, they gave me information, and basically me as a student would deconstruct it and give my thoughts and really think about it myself. So obviously thanks to those great teachers, I was also learning about a lot of these like actual terms for things like racism, colorism, all the isms. Like they're very technical terms, right? Which people experience every day, but they may not know the word to it. But yeah, through that, once I came to UCI, I already knew a lot of that stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, that's really great that you learned a lot from your teachers. And I like that you mentioned that they didn't just feed you information, but they gave it to you so that you were able to deconstruct it on your own. And then I also like that you mentioned that racism, it's not necessarily just like hate crimes and that kind of thing, but there's a lot of like specific terminologies like microaggressions that people of color may not know the name to, but they experience on a daily basis. And even though it's like a less extreme form of racism, it still is racism.
Yes.
And yeah, and then you sort of touched on this, but how has your racial identity shaped you and influenced your advocacy towards racial equity?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question because I know I did mention I'm Mexican American. So a lot of the times with being Mexican, it's like we don't really have a race because of colonization. I know it's something most people don't really think about, but obviously Mexico was colonized by Spain. So in that sense, a lot of Mexicans can be a mixture of two races. So you can be indigenous and you could also be Spaniard or white. But obviously, because it's a very violent history, it's not like we can track down our heritage and be like, 40% this and 50% that, right? So a lot of it is just we focus our identity more with our ethnicity, specifically me being Mexican American because I was born and raised here. But obviously, my parents are from Mexico. So yeah, I mean, race in itself is a social construct, but we even if it's a social construct created by colonizers, it's still something very present in our lives. But yeah, I mean, definitely like I think that like identity crisis sometimes happens because you are, for example, me, because I'm a mixture of both, like obviously it's not like 50-50, right? Because that's it's not that realistic. But I can't claim an indigenous identity because obviously I don't even have that connection anymore. And I also can't claim a white identity because I'm not white passing. I do not have any benefits of being a white person. So definitely a weird thing. So yeah, we mainly identify with being our ethnicity. But yeah, I mean, being Mexican American in itself in East LA, because again, I said it's a very historic community known for the Chicano movement, specifically the East LA walkouts. So very quick history on the East LA walkouts. It was, I believe, like 5 high schools in the East LA area. I attended one, which was Roosevelt High School. Basically, education in that time, this is like 1960s. They mainly gave us like labor type of jobs. That was like our education. So even now, like when I went to high school there, a lot of the classrooms used to be like cooking classes, which I'm like, and then our art class used to be like a mechanic room, which obviously are really cool skills to learn. It was just an issue of like college access. And, they weren't preparing us for college. They were preparing us to go into labor inducive fields. And obviously we could never have social mobility through those fields alone. So these 5 high schools walked out for, I believe, like a series of months. And they basically demanded change, and they thankfully did get it. But yeah, there was a lot of police violence during the protests. Like during the walkouts, like the administrators would close the doors to the school and the like students would like jump over the fence, but on the other side of the fence was the police waiting for them like to beat them with batons. It's definitely very unfortunate, but because of that history and because I understand that history, I find the value in racial equity. And I understand like what you have to do, like there can be change, and there's always room for more change. But yeah, it's just about learning how to stand up for yourself. Yeah, and also I know I mentioned MEChA. I was part of MEChA for 2 years. I was La Escuelita chair, which basically I monitored a mentorship program for first year students, college students. And I would basically pair them with a mentor that was 3rd or 4th year. But aside from that, I also did a lot of work with MEChA itself. We had programs every Wednesday at 5. It might change because there's a new board now, but historically for 2 years it was Wednesday at 5. And we usually touch on topics like racism, colorism, sexism, all that type of thing. But we're really focused on educating within. So we really want to educate other people from the Latino community to really question the things we've been taught growing up. A lot of times it's very like anti-Black, anti-indigenous that we don't even realize. A good like I know I mentioned some like terms that we deconstruct. I know they're in Spanish, but I'll still say them. It says like the phrase of "hay que mejorar la raza" is basically a translation. It's like, oh, you should marry a white person so the race can improve. It's just funny that we say race because again, we don't even have a race. But basically, it's a very common phrase said in the Latino community. It's like marry white and not like Black or brown because we want like to be better. Obviously, quotations to this. And also words like Prieto or India or like derogatory terms to call like an indigenous person or any affiliation to an indigenous person. So we really construct these type of words and things that we say in our everyday lives and really question it and talk about the history and like the racism of it. But yeah.
Oh, that's very valuable. I think it's great that MEChA works on breaking down those terms and like those sayings that are inherently racist. Is it kind of just like a club at UCI, or is it so it's an organization at UCI? Does it advocate primarily for the Latinx community and also expand to other races or other ethnicities? Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I always say race and ethnicity because it just gets complicated. But yes, so MEChA is an umbrella org at the Cross Cultural Center, which means there was 5 umbrella orgs, and they basically created the Cross Cultural Center. They advocated for it, and the Cross Cultural Center was made. Very quick history. But yeah, MEChA is the only Latino political group on campus. We call ourselves political because we talk a lot about social issues, and social issues come together with political issues. So yeah, we do a lot of activism, a lot of educating. We also have our mentorship program, and then this year we had a branch for Central American students. MEChA is open to all Latinos, but historically it was only made for Mexican American students. But obviously we wanted to open it up because there's a lot of Central American students here too. And everyone is invited. In our meetings, we sometimes do have people who are not Latino, and that is totally fine. Like we open it up to everyone because every day is like a learning experience, right? If they want to come and learn, then that's totally fine. I think the only thing we ask is to know when to step up and when to step back. If it's not your space, if we're speaking about something very specific, then maybe it's not the time to talk about that. But yeah, we're pretty inclusive. We invite everyone if you want to learn. But yeah.
That's really great. And also, yeah, thank you for sharing about the East LA walkouts. I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about a lot. Like the curriculum that high schools offer can really kind of alter where their life goes. Like, for example, just staying within like mechanics, like what you mentioned, versus going into fields of education and other subjects that are also very valuable. And thank you for also mentioning kind of the difference between race and ethnicity. And I think it was really interesting that you brought up a lot of Mexican Americans don't necessarily identify with a race because of the Spaniard and like the white conquering and all of that. So I think that was really interesting. And I think that's a perspective that people should definitely hear more about.
Yeah, thank you.
So kind of going alongside that same idea, how can race activists improve to be fully inclusive of and best highlight the Latinx community?
Yeah, so I found this question very interesting as well, because honestly, activism is it's a lot of hard work. Like, it's very time consuming. Like, it can take an emotional toll because sometimes things don't change, right? So I think while it can be very difficult and it can sometimes be easy to be canceled. Cancel culture obviously exists. I think as long as activists are taking initiative to always improve and have an open mind and always learn about new things and not just be very specific to your community, because obviously all communities of color have a lot of overlap. Obviously, we all experience racism in different or similar ways. So I think as long as they're, trying to improve, that's the best that they can do. I think sometimes a lot of the conflict comes from within as well. I know there's a good example, again, the Chicano movement. There's a lot of things I focus on, so I'm going to give very similar examples. But in the Chicano movement, obviously both men and women were participating in the movement, but a lot of times the men took the lead on everything, and they just wanted the women to support them. And so usually they would give them all the like domestic jobs, like cook 100 meals for everyone that's participating in the movement or things like that. It was very much like, oh, you are just there for this, and we're the ones in the movement. And a lot of times, obviously, that caused issues because women were like, well, I'm fighting for equality as being Mexican American, but I'm also fighting for equality as being a woman. So there's a lot of like intersectionality that sometimes is not highlighted. but yeah, I mean, it's really an irony to
Mhm.
fight for equality, but then have discrimination within the movement. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That kind of reminds me, I did a National History Day project, which is kind of just us choosing a topic in history. And so I created a documentary, and it was about a woman named Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and she was partaking in the pre-Civil War era, the anti-abolitionist movement, or the
Yeah.
abolitionist movement, yeah.
Uh,
And one thing that was unique about her, I feel like she's not as well known. Like you hear about Frederick Douglass and other people who really took a stand during that era, but a lot of their activism wasn't inclusive of women, which is what kind of relates to what you were saying. She really took the stand in including women in the movement, in the abolitionist movement, and all of that. It definitely shows that there's similar issues that occur within different communities. But
mm.
yeah, essentially like intersectionality and ideas like those, they're definitely common.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's definitely make sure the movement within has usually movements in itself also have some issues.
So, what has been the most valuable aspect of working with cultural organizations on campus?
Yeah, so my role at the Cross Cultural Center, I was a student assistant, which basically means I help a lot with like the technical things, so like room reservations, make sure the space is good. I did do some presentations throughout the year. A lot of times I worked with cultural organizations through the programs, like I would partner with them and I would do like a program together. But I specifically, outside of my role at the Cross Cultural Center, was part of MEChA. Like I mentioned earlier, I was La Escuelita chair, mentorship program, but honestly, I really loved being part of MEChA. It was great. I was part of it through high school, um, and I'm now in college. But one of the presentations I did for MEChA, which was my favorite, was called. It was basically on racism in Mexico, which it was. I was talking about racism in Mexico, but I was also kind of comparing to how racism in Mexico is a little bit different from racism in the US, just because in the US there was racial segregation and in Mexico there was not. But there's obviously still a lot of racism, and a lot of racism in Mexico is reflected through microaggressions. Like it's just everyday life that this happens. I know I mentioned some like phrases that are commonly used. So this is also a great example of racism. It's very ingrained. Also, I mean, I won't give you the whole presentation, but basically the Spaniards did like a caste system, and based off that caste system, it really like trickled down into Mexico's like ideals. But I even read a whole book for this presentation. I'm not sure if you know the actor Tenoch Huerta. He came out in Wakanda, the second Wakandan movie. He wrote a book called Orgullo Prieto, which basically just translates to like brown pride, and he deconstructs how racism in Mexico happens, all of that. So I read that whole book to make this presentation. And surprisingly, this was one of the presentations where there was a little bit more like conflict, in the sense that, sometimes this information can come a little new to people. And we did have like some conflict in the conversation, very discussion based, where I was talking about racism in Mexico and how brown Mexicans specifically experience racism in everyday life, right? So aside from being Mexican, being brown also causes more racism. And obviously there's also a lot of white Mexicans in Mexico. And so during this conversation, like a lot of the white Mexicans were the ones speaking, and they started talking about how they've been discriminated against for being white. And then we're like, oh, like, yeah, you can be discriminated against, but then we were explaining how you can't be racist to a white person. And obviously this was a very like, people were like, how can you not be racist to a white person? And basically we're like, well, racism is institutional, and the institution was created by white people, so you can't be racist to them. You can discriminate against them, you can offend their feelings, but you can't be racist towards them because racism is institutional. So, we definitely had that discussion, and we really had to monitor it and like bring it back to the point. And we're like, okay, maybe right now is not about you, If you discriminate against for being white is one thing, but it has nothing to do with racism. Obviously, this presentation was to really highlight how anti-Black and anti-indigenous a lot of the community is. So we really had to call it back. This was definitely one of my favorite presentations, mainly because I put a lot of effort into it. I put a lot of effort into all the presentations. I wrote a whole book for this. And also the book was in Spanish, so I speak Spanish, but I didn't learn academic Spanish to the level of someone growing up in Mexico, obviously. So, I challenged myself a little bit. But yeah.
Your presentation sounds really amazing. Yeah, I would
Thank
love to
you.
see it sometime.
Yes, of
And
course.
yeah, I like that you mentioned reverse racism as like part of what occurred in the discussion. I know that that's like especially a hot topic when kind of talking about race, because the idea of race being something that's institutional and not something that's like more individual is, I feel like, lesser known within like our country. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
And yeah, someone who's really involved at UCI, how can universities improve their policies and daily practices to better promote racial equity and become more racially inclusive for students and faculty?
That's a great question. My initial thought is like money. Money is always needed everywhere, but I think recently there's been like less money given to the Cross Cultural Center, so that in itself is a great example. Like the Cross does a lot of work with diversity and equity, so why would you fund them less? And then also a lot of the orgs, like cultural orgs, I'm not sure if you know this, but orgs don't actually get funding for functioning. Like they themselves have to fundraise and make sure that they have money to function, but then UCI gets all the name, I guess, for
Mhm.
having all these like student orgs. So let's say you're a senior in high school and you come to tour UCI and they're like, yeah, we have like 200 orgs, like, like we're a great school. We have a lot of organizations, which obviously is great. But how many of those organizations do they fund, right? Like these are student-led organizations. And I think a lot of it is like, well, they need more funding if they're going to be giving UCI that like prestige. That's the word. But yeah, I think it can definitely start there, because it's really difficult. Like even getting a room at UCI costs a lot of money. For the Cross Cultural Center, if you're affiliated with us, then rooms are for free. But for other orgs, like you have to pay a lot of money. And it's also a very big process. So like it's just difficult, And I think also UCI says they're a Hispanic serving institution, but how many resources do we have for those students? And a lot of times like there's conflicts on UCI with the Latinx community. So it's also about like addressing those things. It's a lot of things. Yeah, I mean, also a great example is Nuestra grad. It's like a Latino graduation, and it's very student led. And also UCI gets the recognition for having a Latina like graduation, because let's say I want to apply to UCI and I'm deciding between UCI and another school. And I'm like, oh, they have a Latino graduation. That's great. I want to have a Latino graduation, right? So then I pick UCI, but then UCI doesn't actually fund Nuestra grad. So it's a lot of like, they need to support more and not just leave everything to the students.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that especially what you were saying with funding, I think the reason a lot of these organizations even have to start up is because a lot of the racial and ethnic education isn't necessarily completely integrated in the curriculum at like high school levels or college levels or even below. And yeah, I really like that you mentioned your presentation earlier. And I think that if we had classes that where students could create presentations like that and share them with the class and have discussions based on those presentations, I think it would be really valuable. So it definitely is very important that these organizations that are doing this work are getting the funding.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, I'm also an education major. A lot of my work is also like on ethnic studies. I'm a huge promoter for ethnic studies in high school and K through 12, honestly. Like that the education doesn't start till college and it can start a little earlier.
So I had one last question. What are some ways that young adults can promote racial equity and create change in our community?
As I like said throughout this interview, it's like I find a lot of value in education. So I think that if you're making an effort to educate yourself, and obviously there's a lot of resources on campus, like Cross Cultural Center, the student orgs, there's a lot of resources to educate yourself. I think as long as you're making that effort, then that can create change, because then you'll start talking to your parents or your family or your friends. You'll start questioning like what you believe this whole time. So yeah, I mean, I believe in growth, and not everyone's gonna come in knowing everything. It's just as long as you have an open mind, I think that can create a lot of change.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you found it informative, be sure to follow us to stay updated with our weekly releases. Let's race again next time!